Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this session on equality and diversity in ELC practice. And I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Dr. Stella Louie as our speaker this afternoon. Stella is a freelance early years consultant. She's a trainer and an author. She's very well known in Scotland for her work on children's schemas, and she's also written extensively on observation and its part in developing learning. Stella also leads a team of Froebelian travelling tutors in promoting and developing and delivering short Frobel Trust courses. She's worked in the United Kingdom and also internationally and in South Africa, where she works with practitioners and teachers to develop a Froebelian approach. This afternoon, Stella is going to be inviting us to reflect on the quality of our ELC provision. She's going to examine how we can challenge pedagogical practice and values through having conversations about stereotypes, unconscious bias, and challenging some of the myths about people, culture, and communities. I am absolutely certain that we are in for a very thought-provoking and inspiring session. There will be an opportunity possibly to ask questions at the end. If we have enough time, please pop them into the chat and we'll try to get to them. If you're tweeting, we're using the hashtag SLF online, and it will be great to continue the conversation there in Twitter. So now I'm just going to upload Stella's PowerPoint for us, and then I will hand over to her, and hopefully it will all go nice and smoothly. The slides are just coming.
Brilliant, thank you. What a lovely, lovely warm welcome. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to my session, which I've titled Equality and Diversity and ELC Practice. My name is Dr. Stella Louie, and I'm absolutely delighted to be with you this afternoon. Before I start my talk, I want to pose a question. And it's a question that I think we're going to be returning to throughout my time with you today. Can I have the next slide, please? And the question is this: are we doing everything that we can to ensure that all children have the opportunity to develop a positive self-identity, self-esteem, and respect for others? And I think this is a really, really important question when thinking about equality and diversity. Are we doing everything that we can to ensure that all children have the opportunity to develop a positive self-identity, self-esteem, and respect for others? Can I have the next slide? I think what I want to talk about first is the following definitions: equality, equity, race, diversity, and inclusion. These are all words that within our sector, within our field, we talk about all the time. And legally, under the Race Relations Act 2010, there are some protected characteristics, and one of those is race. You've also got gender, you've also got disability. So these are things that we're having to do, but let's have a focus on what these definitions mean. Equality. What does equality mean for you? Equality for me means recognising that children come from diverse backgrounds and experiences. But equality for me means treating children fairly. And the word fairly is key. I think quite often, people often misunderstand equality to mean treating all children the same. The key for me to understanding equality, it's about treating children fairly, but recognising their diverse needs. Let's look at how equality and equity kind of link. Equity is a really, really important word. It's important because it's about giving children what they need. It's not the same as treating children the same, but it's about giving children what they need here and now. So, for example, we could have two children, and one child is short, one child is slightly taller, but both children are trying to see what's happening over a wall. if we give the children a block each, the taller child might be able to see over the fence, but the shorter child won't. We need to give the shorter child maybe 3 or 4 blocks in order for him or her to be able to see what's over the wall. So my point is, equity is about giving children, individual, unique children, giving them what they need here and now, whereas equality is about treating children the same, and there is a huge difference. I think, you know, throughout my talk today, I am going to focus on race. So I'll be coming back to race again and again. But race is about our physical characteristics, our skin colour, hair texture, hair colour, eyes and mouth shape. The reality is that race is socially constructed, and it's often, it often absolutely defines people's lived experiences. So for me, we must consider how we encourage children to recognise their own unique characteristics and qualities, and those that they share with other people. And I almost want to share a little. I want to share a little story with you. I met a newly qualified teacher recently that told me of a scenario that was happening in her primary 1 class. She said she had 2 groups of girls, some Bengali girls and some white Scottish girls. And the white Scottish girls were excluding the Bengali girls from their play. And she said the white children were being quite horrid. In fact, they had come up with a name for their group. They had called themselves a gang, and they had decided to call themselves the ice cream gang, the vanilla gang. And the Bengali girls couldn't join this gang because they were chocolate. And I share this with you because she said she could see that the behaviour and play she saw being acted out in her classroom was wrong, but she didn't know, A, how to support the child or group of children that were being excluded, and B, how to deal with the children that was doing the excluding. So there are 2 issues here, just with race. Let's think about diversity. Diversity is about the differences that arise from things like race, class, education, gender, ethnic background, religious background, cultural heritage, language, disability, sexuality and appearance. Each child's experience is unique and diverse. You could have children that come from this household, but their experiences are diverse. I think what becomes important is that we've got to take children's diversity into account. We've got to take these differences into account in order to challenge existing inequalities, just like they were existing inequalities for that primary 1 class. Diversity and equality must acknowledge children's diverse experience. Otherwise, prejudice and discriminatory practice will remain. So you can already see how equality, equity, race and diversity all kind of feel like they are interlinked. Inclusion. I think for me, inclusion is absolutely key. Inclusion is about the process by which we go about our everyday practice, in which we value the individual children and their families, and we recognise their unique attributes, their qualities, and their ways of being. So in order, I think, to have any kind of conversation about equality and diversity, we also must remember all of these phases: equality, diversity, equity, inclusion, and race. Okay.
Check that has the PowerPoint disappeared? It's disappeared from my screen.
Yeah, it's disappeared from my screen as well. Whilst we sort that out, I have a question. And I guess the question I have for you is this: do you find it difficult talking about race? I'll repeat the question. Do you find it difficult talking about race? And if your answer is yes, you do, I guess my question to you is why? And if you're sitting wherever you are and you're thinking, no, I don't find it difficult talking about race, again, I'm going to ask you why. So do you find it difficult talking about race? I mean, could I have the next slide, please? It may surprise you to know that I find it difficult talking about race. Talking about race is not easy. It's not free from emotion. It's who I am. I think language is often cited as a huge barrier to people feeling uncomfortable talking about race. And I guess that this stems from a fear of not wanting to get it wrong, not wanting to cause or even cause offence to people. I think my following slide that I have is a selection of words and phrases that, typically speaking, people find really uncomfortable. And I think what I want to do is I want to go on to the next slide, and I just want you to have a look at all these words and phrases and register what some of them are making you feel. I will go through some of them, but just register what they're making you feel. Okay, I want to look at BAME, B-A-M-E, and I mean that stands for Black, Asian and Minority Ethnic. That phase makes me feel quite uncomfortable. The term is used widely by government departments and public bodies and media and others when referring to ethnic minority groups. But the assumption is that BAME people all have the same lived experiences, and they don't. So even if we take the A from the BAME, and that stands for Asian, but, you know, are they talking about Indian? Are they talking about Bengali? Are they talking about Pakistani? Are they talking about Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Malaysian? You know, all of these countries and people come under that A umbrella. So for me, I just find that BAME term far too broad. So if I'm talking about an issue, my view is this: it's really important that we're specific and deliberate in our choice of language. So if I'm talking about issues that affect Bengali children, then it's really important that I say Bengali, because without being specific in my choice of language, it's harder to identify a meaningful solution to the problem. And also, I think it muddies the water. And I think similar to BAME is person of colour. Person of colour I find quite tricky. And it kind of evokes mixed reactions. It's an American term that was started. It became much more used with the Black Lives Matter movement. But for me, you know, it's about thinking about what you're trying to say. A person of colour could be me, it could be someone from Japan, it could be someone from Pakistan, it could be someone from South Africa. We need to be specific in our language and what it is that we're trying to say. Another one I'm gonna pull up, and I remember doing research and feeling quite alarmed by this one. You know, I don't see colour. For a long time in the 1970s, people were actually encouraged not to see race. It was thought that noticing someone's race meant that you were racist. And, you know, just like we have this Black Lives Matter movement, back in the 70s, there was a movement called the colourblindness movement. You know, I've alluded to the fact earlier on that race is ingrained and it's socially constructed. You know, unfortunately, it often defines people's lived experiences. So the problem with statements that like this that pretend not to see race, what they do is it attempts to delete or erase someone's lived experiences. And I think that's a huge barrier to understanding issues and ultimately fixing them. I'm gonna look at white privilege. And just like BAME made me feel uncomfortable, white privilege may make some of you feel quite uncomfortable. But I think it's important that you understand accepting white privilege does not dismiss the cross-section of struggle that comes from class disadvantage. What white privilege does is it seeks to highlight how race is a barrier that being white means that you are free from. You know, if you're white, you're more likely to benefit from a society in a way that non-white people cannot. That does not mean that you don't have your own struggles, but it does mean you have one thing less that you have to worry about that's a significant cause of concern to other people of a different race. You know, in your reality, you will see people that look like you in successful positions on TV shows. There'll be heroes, there'll be heroines, they'll be in your books. You live in a society where white is the ideal and the norm. Ignoring it because it makes you feel uncomfortable or angry and defensive is in fact part of the problem. Accepting white privilege enables you to be a better ally to children that are maybe different from yourself. And I think the last one I'm gonna look at is microaggressions. And I think microaggressions is when someone sees someone like me and they say to me, "Oh, Stella, where are you from?" And I say, "Oh, I'm from London." And then "Nah, Stella, where are you from?" So I get a bit more specific. I say, "I'm from Clapham." And they're like, "Nah, Stella, where are you from?" And I'm thinking now, do you want my postcode? Of course they don't want my postcode. What they're really asking me is, what's my family heritage? What's my cultural background? If that's the question you're asking me, then be specific and ask me. But if you're asking me where I'm from, I'm going to tell you I am from London, because that is exactly where I'm from. And I think microaggressions happen all the time. It's about expectations, it's about stereotypes, it's about biases, it's about thinking about our body language, what we sometimes say with our bodies to families that we may not connect with. So language becomes really important. I'm going to try something now that I saw on a TED talk. And it worked really well on the TED Talk, so I'm hoping that it will work here. I'm going to ask you all to do a visualization, and what's important is the visualization part is really an important part of this process. So take a deep breath and close your eyes. I want you to visualize a child that is overachieving, a child that is solitary, quiet and reflective, and a child who's cooperative and well-behaved. So 3 images: a child that's overachieving, a child that's solitary, quiet and reflective, and a child that it's cooperative and well-behaved. I'll give you a minute. Okay, I hope you've got your visualizations. I have some questions for you. Was the child that was overachieving black? Was the child that was solitary, quiet and reflective, was that child deaf? And was the child that was cooperative and well-behaved, was that a Bengali little girl? Do you know what? It's absolutely okay if all of your answers or one of your answers is no. What you're able to pull up with your visualization are children that you are familiar with. And I think the familiarity becomes really, really important. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, because I think our familiarity plays into our unconscious bias. What are unconscious bias? You know, unconscious bias is the snap or automatic judgments that we make before we've even realized that we've made them. And quite often our biases don't align to our consciously held beliefs. You know, where do they come from? Our biases develop from our socialization with our parents, our grandparents, our cousins, our friends, how we're socialized, our personal experiences, you know, the media, how we see people and things represented. You know, that's how we get our values and our beliefs. And all of these experiences almost act as a filter in which we make judgments of the things that we see children and their families doing. And what we tend to do is we categorize people and put them into groups. And I guess that's where things like stereotypes come in. And stereotyping is when we generalize about a particular group. And in my experience, such generalizations are common and influence how people treat and interact with children and the opportunities that we give them. So it's not just about how we interact, it's the opportunities that we afford children. And I think unconscious bias really plays into the observation and the assessment process. Our observations and our assessments are subjective. They're based on our beliefs and our values and our interpretations. And I think we need to be aware that our unconscious bias can lead to incorrect assessments, resulting in us not following children's interest or planning for them appropriately, thereby affecting their learning and development and their progression. And that's not what we want. If we think about equity, equity is about giving children what they need. I think our biases come into play when we use our observations to build in children's interest and or extend or support their learning. Our biases really come into play. Our biases also come into play when we react when children say they don't want to do something that we've asked them to do. Our biases will come into play. But in the time that I've got, I want to look at these 4 biases. And, you know, whether I've said it or not, we are all biased. Every single person that's part of this discussion is biased. There's nothing wrong with being biased. But there is something about not being aware of what your unconscious biases are, because that's when they become dangerous. So let's look at affinity bias. Affinity bias is when we're much more comfortable with people that look like us, act like us, behave like us. And I remember years ago, I did some work in Southwark in London, and I was working with Black and Afro-Caribbean parents and Bengali parents. I had a natural affinity with the Black and Afro-Caribbean parents. They would say things and I understood what they meant. I got the nuances and they didn't have to explain things to me. Whereas with the Bengali parents, not only was there an issue in translation because I didn't speak their mother tongue, I didn't know them as well. And because I wanted equity in my courses for the Black and Afro-Caribbean group and the Bengali group, I was, you know, I needed to be aware of my affinity bias. It wasn't a bad bias, but I didn't want to give them the same. I wanted to give each group what they needed. So it meant I needed to do some research on the Bengali family so I could counter my bias. And I think it's important that you hear this. There's nothing wrong with having an affinity bias, but we must find ways to counter it when our affinity can mean that we're not treating people fairly. Remember, it's not about treating people the same, but we're not treating them fairly. The other bias I want to look at is confirmation bias. I think confirmation bias is when we only consider the information that conforms or confirms our preconceptions about children and their families. And confirmation bias is sometimes referred to as the systematic errors that people make. And it also actually affects our ability to recall, remember, even in the face of evidence that disproves our bias. So my example of that would be, let's just say we believe that little Johnny doesn't like singing, doesn't engage with singing in any of the activities that the teacher initiates. So we will use that information to make assessments of little Johnny, but what we won't see, or Tommy, what we won't see is when he's outside and is involved in his own activity, he's singing away to his heart content. So in some respects, confirmation bias seeks to look for the things that validate and affirm the way we already see children, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. So we've got to think about confirmation bias and where it is at play. Excuse me. Okay, attribution bias is when we'll find reasons to justify our own actions. For example, a child knocks over another child, and rather than stop to find out what happens, we're more likely to blame the child's character. We won't even consider whether the floor was wet, the child's laces were undone. And I think what attribution bias does is it judges people based on our prior observations, assuming things about a person without actually knowing the full story. And I've seen attribution bias at play at the start of this term. You know, how many of us are guilty of saying, watch out for Stella, she's a nightmare, or little Tommy? You know, we have these ideas about children and their families, and we kind of go and we'll pre-warn people about these characteristics. Find ways to counter them with all our biases. Being biased is a natural thing to do, but you've got to find ways to counter your biases once you realise that they're there. And the last bias I want to talk about for this session is conformity bias. And this is where people act similar to the people that's around them, regardless of their personal belief. They'll match their opinion to the majority. But once they've gone away from those people, they kind of, you know, almost change their mind. All of us are guilty of interacting with all of these different biases, but we need to be aware of our biases. Remember what I said, our values, our beliefs, our attitudes, all of these things are learned early and they are ingrained. And we are going to have to reflect on our practice, our interactions with children and families, to find out how we feel what we feel and why we believe what we believe, and how this affects the way in which we think about and behave towards children and their families, particularly those that are from different cultural backgrounds than ourselves. And I think unless we really take time to reflect honestly on our attitudes, our feelings, our preconceptions, our tendencies to be biased and stereotype children and their families, we can't really say that we've given it due consideration. So so biases become really important, and they are always at play in our observations. And just to kind of draw a line under this, I'm going to say this. Being conscious of our unconscious bias really matters. And it matters whether it's in relation to race, gender, sexuality, disability, or class. Yes, we're going to have them, but we've got to find ways, meaningful ways to counter them. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, and I think this is really, really important. If we want equality for all our children, we need to think about our attitudes, our behaviour and our practice. And I think also we need to understand that quite a lot of the things that children learn, including biases and stereotype, whether they're valued or not, they learn from the adults around them. And we are important adults that are around them. I think, you know, I've alluded to it earlier on, language sometimes becomes a barrier to talking about race, but we have a legal responsibility to safeguard children's race, their disability, their gender and their sexuality. These things we have to do. So, you know, the idea of equity, equality, diversity, race and inclusion shouldn't really be new. we do need to challenge attitudes. And, you know, sometimes we will have to ask some difficult questions. And my next few slides really is trying to encourage us to think about what kind of questions we need to ask and reflecting on our practice. Next slide, please. You know, how are we helping children to develop a positive sense of themselves? You know, children need to figure out who they are, where they come from. How are we supporting them? Particularly children that are from different countries, to understand their traditions and their customs so that they can take pride in who they are and where they're from. You know, how is race and culture explored with our children through the activities that we offer them? You know, I put this in because this is so important. Children must not be placed in a dilemma about their own sense of worth. I think how we support children to develop a positive sense of who they are becomes important. It's about how they learn about themselves, what they can do. These things become really important. And I think if I go back to the scenario of the newly qualified teacher, I think it's really important that when we're helping children develop a sense of belonging, we need to help the children that are doing the excluding, and we also need to support the children that's being excluded. That becomes really important if we're going to help them to develop a sense of belonging. But I also think we need to remember that everything children learn, including biases and stereotypes, they learn from those that are around them. We've got to think about children's unique development, their individual interests, their communication styles, their learning styles. All of these things help them to develop a sense of belonging and identity about who they are. Next slide, please. I think our work with parents become important. You know, I've said time and time again, I have met many parents that have shared stories with me about their children's race. And some of the stories are heartbreaking. You know, one mum told me that her daughter would scrub her skin so that she could become white. Another one said her daughter just refused to go to school because she wanted to be like the other girls. And, you know, whilst I've been doing this training, I've heard other stories, you know, of someone from Thailand saying that, you know, the children, the 3-year-olds, will get flour and water and cover themselves with paste so they will be lighter. In China, there is a desire to be lighter because that's seen as much more pure. In India, it's more appropriate to say you're from the north of the country, because if you're from the south, you're gonna be so much darker. I think, you know, when we talk about race, it's not just a black and white thing, it's a global thing, it's a universal thing. And we've got to find ways to support our children and our families. But, you know, parents are saying children are kind of rubbing their skin off. And I find it heartbreaking. And I think, you know, these are not conversations I'm having back in the day. These are conversations that I'm having today. We've got to find ways where we work with parents, where we're showing them mutual respect, and we're maintaining a dialogue with them. And we're valuing the knowledge that they're bringing to us about their children. All of those things become important. And I think, you know, making time to listen to parents' concerns rather than like, oh, it's just Mrs. So-and-so. I think it's about thinking about how we work with parents and that delicate balancing act. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, the learning and development. I think what becomes important with learning and development is that we have to think about the impact of the physical environment, but we also have to think about the impact of the emotional environment. Environments have a way, you know, if you're going to be colourblind, Environments have a way of saying come in or go away. You know, what is our environment saying to children, and how are we making sure that the experiences and the activities that we offer them meet their individual needs? I've got an article link that I share with you at the end of this presentation, but I remember one of the case studies, a practitioner told me a story about how she had a theme of hairdressing, and she'd gone out and she'd bought lots of different bits of equipment for the children to practice hairdressing back in the setting. And she also had 2 mixed race children attending the setting. Anyway, she put all the stuff in, and she saw these 2 little mixed race girls run into the home corner for, you know, the hairdressers, and within minutes they just came back out again. They came back out because they said to her, you know, there's nothing there for us. The experiences weren't meeting their individual need. And, you know, I asked the question, can we really say we're doing everything we can to provide children with opportunities so they can develop self, a sense of identity, self-esteem and respect for others? And our environment is a way that we can do that. You know, the resources that we have. I talked earlier on about white privilege, and you know, when you're white, you're going to see lots of people that look like you, but in your learning environments, you know, who are your images represented? Are they just tokenistic, or are they really there in meaningful ways so that your children can make connections with their own learning? And I think for me, there is one huge challenge when I think about the learning environment, and I think that relates to our policies. And I think often our policies are really, really, really well intended. And I saw a classic example of this recently. I was doing some training in Munich, and they were talking about their policy for working with parents, and they were reading off all these amazing things that they were doing, and I was almost mouth to the floor. And then I realised that they were reading a list. This wasn't enacted in practice, it was just in policy. You need to make sure that the two absolutely marry up. It's not just about having a wonderful policy that's going to impress inspectors and people like me. It's making sure that whatever your policy is enacted in practice. And I think that becomes important. And it's also making sure that the activities and the resources that you provide for your children are meaningful. Next slide, please. Okay. Any questions?
Stella, there's 1 or 2 things that have been popped in the chat as we've been going through that you might. Can you see the chat?
No, I can't see the chat, so I'm going to need your eyes.
Okay, so there's a question when you were talking about different sort of acronyms and, you know, BAME and POC. Fergus Murray was saying, I'm wondering, are there times when it makes sense to talk about BAME or POC, like when you want to talk collectively about people who experience racism?
I don't know. I think it depends. I just think what's really difficult about the BAME umbrella is that it's just too broad. Because even if I just took 3, Indian, Asian, or Indian, Pakistani and Bengali, yes, there will be some things that are similar, but there'll be lots of things that are really, really different. And if I'm really trying to focus in on the people or the group of people that I'm working about, the more specific I am, the clearer my water will be. The minute I put that BAME umbrella up, it causes difficulty, because you may or may not know that traveller families are part of the BAME umbrella. Jewish families are part of the BAME umbrella. There are many different types of families, black, brown, and white, that come under that umbrella, which makes, I think, that term so unhelpful.
Hopefully, Fergus, that kind of answers your question. Are there any? Oh yeah, so Fergus has come back. Oh, now we're getting a few things. Thanks for that. I can definitely see that for most purposes, it makes more sense to talk about specific groups. And do cultural biases exist and are exacerbated in other cultures, so much so that white privilege is non-existent? That's an interesting one.
I think it is interesting, but I think what becomes really important is we've got to understand history. And I think once we understand our history, the present makes much more sense. So, for instance, my parents are from a Caribbean island called St. Lucia, and that was colonised by the British Empire. And even within St. Lucia, the fairer skinned you are, the more likely you are to get employment on a shop face. And even if you're poor and white in St. Lucia, you will still be treated in a superior way. So I think what I've been surprised about is how deep this is, and all of it links back to history and the narrative that white was the superior race, and they had to kind of civilize races like my own.
Absolutely, thank you. Somebody's saying a travel experience would be interesting to explore. And also we've got a comment here from Lynn Taylor around the realising the ambition kind of way of looking at things, where we're asked to see the learning environment in terms of the interactions and experiences and spaces, which really can encompass that, all of that you've been talking about, really thinking about the individual child. And I guess, it makes me reflect on the fact that actually children that might come from or seem on the surface to come from the same group will still have very unique and individual experiences. So actually it's about challenging our assumptions about all children.
Absolutely, and I think that's the diversity. Diversity is a word that we use interchangeably all the time, and children do come with their own set of unique and diverse experiences, and it's about how we recognise those, we embrace those, and we find ways. Ultimately, it's the equity, giving children, I believe, what they need, and realising the ambition strives to give children what it is that they need, yet while still being inclusive in the way that we do it. But part of being the best kind of practitioners we can be is about thinking about our practice and reflecting on our practice and finding ways to make sure that some of our unconscious biases become more conscious, and they do chime with our consciously held beliefs. Reflecting on practice, talking about practice, finding ways to counter things. So it's not just looking for an observation that's going to confirm what you think. It's also looking for the one that's going to disconfirm what you think. I think it's important, but reflecting on practice all the time is important, and moving past those feelings of feeling uncomfortable.
And I think you're right, it's sitting with that uncomfortableness, and going back to the very first question that you posed at the beginning, do we find it difficult to talk about race? I mean, I think everybody finds it difficult, and it's uncomfortable, but in order to move forward, we have to sit with that uncomfortableness.
And I think, I want to close by, asking you two things. If I was to ask you to imagine those three scenarios again, I wonder how many of you would imagine a child that you're not familiar with. But I do want to go back to that question. Are we doing everything we can to make sure that children have opportunities where they can develop their self-identity. That's who they are. They can develop their self-esteem and ultimately show respect for others. Thank you.
Fantastic, Stella. Thank you so much for that. It was a superb presentation, and I think everybody here is going to have a lot to take away and think about. I'm noticing practitioners in the chat that are not just ELC, somebody from secondary, you know, so this is a message for all of us. You're getting lots of thanks in the chat.
Absolutely my pleasure. And you know what? I am 7.8% Scottish, and I'm going to leave it there. Yes, yes.
You're one of our own.
Absolutely. But thank you for inviting me.
And thank you for being here. And for people who are here and they want to share this with colleagues, then it will be available as a recording after the Scottish Learning Festival is over. So look out for advertising that, and please do share widely. It's a conversation we all need to be having, you know, on a continuous basis. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Enjoy.
Take care.
Bye.